Robert Bartlett had spent most of his life facing danger, ice that could crush ships, storms that could swallow entire crews, long Arctic winters that tested even the strongest men. But according to one sailor, the most unsettled Bartlett had ever looked wasn't during a storm. It was during a calm night in September 1930. Just after midnight, a crewman rushed across the deck carrying something wrapped in heavy canvas. He wasn't supposed to be there. Most of the ship was asleep, but whatever he had found couldn't wait until morning. The sailor went straight to Bartlett's cabin. Minutes later, the captain emerged. The two men exchanged only a few words before disappearing into the darkness beyond the ship's lantern light. Nearly an hour passed. Crew members watched from a distance. Nobody followed. Nobody asked questions. When Bartlett finally returned, several men immediately noticed two things. The canvas-wrapped object was gone, and the captain looked furious, not frightened, not excited, angry. The next morning, Bartlett gathered the crew. What happened next would become one of the strangest moments of his entire career. According to multiple accounts, he issued a direct order. Whatever had been found during the night was not to be discussed outside the expedition. Not with reporters, not with government officials, not with friends after returning home. One sailor later claimed Bartlett repeated the instruction twice. That alone was unusual. Bartlett was known for encouraging observation and careful record-keeping. Scientists trusted him because he believed evidence mattered. He wasn't the kind of explorer who silenced discussion without a reason. So what had happened during that missing hour? And what was inside the canvas? For decades, nobody could answer those questions. Then, nearly 30 years later, a locked metal box arrived at a government office in Ottawa. There was no return address, no explanation, just a short note attached to the lid. Inside were handwritten notes connected to Bartlett's expedition. Private notes, not official reports, not documents intended for public release. And according to the archivist who examined them, one detail appeared over and over again. A location. A place that did not appear on official maps. At first, officials assumed it was a navigation mistake. Explorers made them all the time. But then another record surfaced. Then another. Different years. Different people. Same location. Suddenly the mystery became much larger than a missing box or a secret order aboard a ship. Because now multiple expeditions appeared to be pointing toward the exact same place. And every time someone got close to understanding what was there, the story seemed to take a strange turn. Some crew members refused to discuss it. Certain records vanished. Arguments broke out among people who had seen it with their own eyes. And through it all, Bartlett remained silent. If he had simply discovered a new Arctic landmark, why keep it secret? If he had found nothing unusual, why order his crew not to talk? And if the answer was hidden inside the canvas-wrapped object that vanished that night, why did nobody ever record what became of it? Those questions would eventually lead researchers into forgotten expedition logs, private letters, abandoned survey reports, and eyewitness accounts scattered across several decades. But before any of that happened, another explorer had already encountered the same location years earlier. And what he reported would make Bartlett's silence far harder to explain. Before we continue, let me know in the comments. If you discovered something that could change history but couldn't prove it, would you reveal it, or keep it secret until you had undeniable evidence? The other explorer wasn't famous. In fact, when historians first stumbled across his name, most had never heard of him. His name was Erik Lund, a Norwegian surveyor who spent years mapping remote sections of the Arctic during the early 20th century. Unlike the celebrated explorers of his era, Lund wasn't chasing headlines. He wasn't writing best-selling books. His job was simple. Go where the maps were incomplete, measure what existed, record it accurately. That's exactly why what happened in 1919 caught everyone's attention. More than a decade before Bartlett's strange voyage, Lund entered a region of the Arctic that appeared completely ordinary on existing charts. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then the expedition began recording observations that didn't fit. Temperatures were higher than expected. Bird activity increased dramatically. Several crew members reported patches of exposed ground where thick ice should have been. The men checked their instruments, then checked them again. The readings stayed the same. One crewman reportedly joked that they had sailed into the wrong season. Nobody laughed, because the numbers were becoming difficult to ignore. Lund wasn't a man prone to dramatic conclusions. In his report, he avoided speculation entirely. But he did leave behind one sentence that would later become incredibly important. He recommended that future expeditions return and conduct a more detailed survey of the area. That recommendation sat in an archive for years. Then something strange happened. No major survey followed. The report faded into obscurity, and the location largely disappeared from discussion, at least publicly. Because when researchers later compared Lund's records with the private notes found inside the Ottawa box, they discovered something remarkable. The coordinates matched closely. Not exactly, but closely enough that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. Two separate expeditions, 2 different decades, 2 different groups of men, both focused on the same isolated region. That was the first major breakthrough. For the first time, the mystery wasn't connected only to Bartlett. Now there was evidence that someone else had encountered the same place years earlier, and that's when another piece of the puzzle emerged. A private letter written by one of Bartlett's crewmen shortly after the voyage. The letter was never meant for public eyes. It was written to his brother. Most of it described ordinary life aboard the ship. The freezing temperatures, the isolation, the endless stretches of ice. Then, near the end, the tone changed. The sailor described an argument, not a disagreement. An argument. According to the letter, several crew members wanted a particular observation included in the expedition's official record. Bartlett refused. The discussion became so heated that one crewman stormed out before it was over. Another reportedly accused the captain of making a mistake. For men operating in one of the harshest environments on Earth, that was highly unusual. Bartlett commanded enormous respect. His crews trusted him. Openly challenging him was rare. So what observation caused experienced sailors to argue with one of the most respected Arctic captains alive? For years, nobody knew. Then another document surfaced. A personal notebook belonging to a junior surveyor. Most of its entries were routine. Weather, distances, supplies, nothing remarkable. Then researchers found an entry written just one day before the argument. The survey team had gone ashore. They expected a short trip. Instead, they stayed away for most of the day. When they finally returned, the atmosphere aboard the ship changed immediately. According to the notebook, several men refused to discuss what they had seen. One appeared visibly shaken. Another spent the evening alone, and Bartlett called a private meeting with the survey team before speaking to anyone else. That meeting was never recorded. No transcript survives. No official summary exists, but the timing was impossible to ignore. The mysterious trip ashore, the private meeting, the argument, the captain's order. All of it happened within less than 48 hours. And then came the discovery that changed everything. While examining photographs taken during the expedition, historians noticed something in the background of one image. At first, it looked insignificant, just another distant shape against the Arctic horizon. Then someone enlarged the photograph, and suddenly the question wasn't what the crew had found. The question became whether they had found something that wasn't supposed to be there at all. The photograph wasn't hidden. It had been sitting in an archive for decades. Anyone could have looked at it. Many probably had. The problem was that nobody was looking at the right thing. The image showed a routine moment from the expedition. Several crewmen unloading equipment. Supply crates stacked near the shoreline. Ice stretching toward the horizon. Nothing unusual. Then one researcher enlarged the background, and everything changed. Far beyond the men, barely visible against the Arctic landscape, stood a dark shape. At first it seemed insignificant, a shadow, A photographic defect, a trick of light. But the more closely investigators examined it, the harder it became to dismiss. The shape appeared in another photograph, then another, taken from different positions, on different days. Whatever it wasn't a flaw in the camera. It had physically existed. That discovery immediately raised a new question. If the object was visible from the expedition route, why had nobody mentioned it publicly? The answer seemed obvious. Maybe it was simply a natural formation, a strange cliff, an unusual rock face. The Arctic is full of landscapes that look far more mysterious than they actually are. Then another piece of evidence surfaced, a rough sketch drawn by one of Bartlett's crewmen. The drawing wasn't artistic. It looked rushed, almost like someone trying to capture a memory before it faded. Yet the shape in the sketch closely resembled the object visible in the photographs. Now investigators had two independent sources, the photographs and a crewman's sketch, both pointing toward the same thing. But the most interesting detail wasn't the shape itself. It was what happened after the survey team reached it. Years later, the daughter of one crew member shared a story her father rarely discussed. According to her, the survey team expected to spend only a few hours examining the site. Instead, they remained away from the ship until nearly sunset. When they finally returned, something felt wrong. Nobody celebrated. Nobody rushed to describe what they had seen. The men were unusually quiet. One surveyor reportedly ignored questions altogether. Another went straight to his cabin. Then Bartlett called an immediate private meeting. Not the next morning, not after reviewing notes. Immediately. Why? That question haunted researchers for years. Then a forgotten inventory record provided the first real answer. The document listed equipment brought back from the survey site. Most of it was completely ordinary. Measuring tools, photography equipment, sample bags. Then one entry stood out, 12 rock samples. That alone wasn't unusual. Survey teams collected samples everywhere they went. The important detail came later. When those samples were analyzed, scientists couldn't agree on what they were looking at. That disagreement would continue for years. And suddenly, the crew argument started making sense. Maybe the conflict wasn't about what they found. Maybe it was about what the discovery meant. Some men believed they were looking at an unusual geological formation. Others believed it was something else entirely. And when people look at the same evidence and reach completely different conclusions, conflict follows. But then the story took its biggest turn yet, because years after Bartlett's voyage, another expedition returned to the same location. Not because of rumors, not because of legends, because those rock samples had attracted attention. And what the new survey team found would force even more people into the same argument Bartlett's crew had started decades earlier. Only this time, the disagreement wouldn't stay aboard a single ship. It would reach government officials, scientists, and surveyors across the country. The second expedition arrived 7 years later. Unlike Bartlett's crew, these men weren't exploring blindly. They came looking for something specific. The rock samples recovered during Bartlett's voyage had attracted attention among geologists, not because anyone believed they had discovered something impossible, but because the samples didn't seem to fit neatly with what experts expected to find in that region. So a new survey was approved. New funding, new equipment, and one clear objective: figure out what Bartlett's team had actually found. At first, the mission seemed routine. The surveyors established camp, mapped the coastline, collected measurements, photographed the surrounding terrain, nothing unusual. Then, on the 6th day, a field surveyor spotted exposed stone protruding through the ice several miles inland. That wasn't strange by itself, but the location was. It sat remarkably close to the area mentioned in Lund's report, the same area connected to Bartlett's notebooks, the same area linked to the mysterious photographs. The team immediately changed priorities. Everything else could wait. They wanted to see the site. When they arrived, several men stopped walking, not because they were frightened, because they were confused. The exposed formation looked different depending on where you stood. From one angle, it appeared completely natural. From another, parts of it seemed oddly structured. Several surfaces appeared unusually straight. Certain angles repeated themselves. Patterns emerged where nobody expected them. One surveyor reportedly joked that nature had suddenly decided to start drawing with a ruler. The joke didn't last long, because the disagreement started almost immediately. One geologist insisted the formation was entirely natural. Another wasn't convinced. A third spent hours taking measurements and refused to commit to either explanation. By the end of the day, the camp was divided, and the division only grew worse over the next week. Why? Because every new observation seemed to support both sides at once. One piece of evidence suggested a natural formation. Another raised new questions. The more they investigated, the less certain anyone became. Then came the discovery that transformed the expedition. While clearing ice from one section of the formation, workers uncovered a repeating pattern beneath the surface. Not writing, not symbols, nothing that dramatic, just lines, angles, repeating geometric features, the sort of thing that immediately captures human attention. The moment word spread through camp, everyone wanted to see it, and suddenly the arguments became even more intense. Some men believed they were looking at an extraordinary geological phenomenon. Others believed the pattern couldn't be explained so easily. For several nights, discussions continued long after midnight. One surveyor later described the atmosphere as less like a scientific expedition and more like a courtroom. Everyone had evidence. Nobody had certainty. Then something happened that nobody expected. Government officials arrived at the site. Not months later. Not after the expedition ended. During the expedition itself. According to transportation records, officials reached the region only days after receiving preliminary reports from the survey team. Their arrival immediately changed the mood. Access to parts of the site became restricted. Certain examinations were postponed. Several planned investigations never took place. The official explanation focused on safety concerns, unstable ice, dangerous terrain, and to be fair, those risks were real. But many members of the expedition felt something else was happening. One surveyor wrote in a private letter that the most important questions were being left unanswered. That letter would later become one of the most discussed documents connected to the mystery, because it captured exactly how people felt, not just during this expedition, but throughout the entire story. Every time someone got close to an answer, the puzzle seemed to become larger. Then came the discovery that connected everything: the photographs, the survey site, the rock samples, the crew argument, even the canvas-wrapped object from that night aboard Bartlett's ship. Because when records from the expedition were finally reviewed years later, investigators found evidence that several items recovered from the site had been shipped south in sealed containers. And according to one inventory record, at least one of those containers may have contained the very object Bartlett ordered removed from the ship that night. For the first time since the story began, the opening mystery was back, and what scientists eventually learned about that object would change the entire investigation for decades. Nobody knew what happened to the object wrapped in canvas. The crew never described it publicly. Bartlett never mentioned it, and the official record seemed to end the moment it disappeared into the darkness that September night. Then a shipping inventory changed everything. The document was buried among hundreds of pages of expedition records. Most of it was routine: equipment, fuel, supplies, nothing remarkable. Then investigators noticed a single entry. One sealed container had been added to the cargo manifest after the survey team's return, not before. After. The container carried no detailed description, only a short note: recovered material, special handling required. That phrase immediately caught attention, because it was different from every other entry on the page, and the dates matched perfectly. The container appeared only hours after the survey team returned from the mysterious site, the same day Bartlett held his private meeting. The same day crew members began arguing. The same day the captain ordered everyone to stay silent. For the first time, researchers had a strong possibility. The object carried aboard the ship that night may have been inside that container. But what exactly was it? The answer emerged years later, not all at once, piece by piece. Scientists examining records from a government laboratory discovered references to an unusual collection of samples received from the Arctic. The material immediately created disagreement, not because it looked extraordinary, because it behaved unexpectedly. Several samples showed evidence of intense heating, others showed signs of rapid freezing. On their own, neither observation was unusual. Together, they made little sense, at least at the time. One laboratory memo described the material as inconsistent with expected regional conditions. That wasn't speculation. That was the actual conclusion of the scientists studying it. And suddenly, a huge portion of the mystery began falling into place. The warmer temperatures reported by Lund, the exposed ground, the unusual wildlife activity, the strange environmental conditions. For the first time, one explanation connected multiple pieces of evidence. Geothermal activity, heat rising from beneath the Earth's surface. Today, that idea seems reasonable, but to explorers operating in the early 20th century, it would have seemed astonishing. Entire sections of the Arctic were still poorly understood. What looked impossible then may have been perfectly natural, and for a moment, it seemed as though the mystery had finally been solved. Then another discovery reopened everything. Because one surviving notebook contained an entry written by a junior surveyor just hours after returning from the site. Most historians expected the passage to discuss geology. Instead, it described people. The surveyor wrote that two senior members of the team nearly came to blows during an argument, not over what they found, over what it meant. One believed the formation was entirely natural. The other insisted that explanation failed to account for everything they had seen. Bartlett eventually stepped in and ended the dispute himself. According to the notebook, the captain listened to both sides before making a statement that silenced the room. The exact wording wasn't recorded, but the surveyor wrote that Bartlett warned the men against reaching conclusions before they had evidence. That moment explains more than any laboratory report ever could. The conflict was never about a rock, or a photograph, or a strange location. The conflict was about interpretation, different people looking at the same evidence and seeing completely different stories. And that pattern would repeat again and again over the next several decades. Scientists disagreed, surveyors disagreed, government officials disagreed. Everyone encountered pieces of the same puzzle. Nobody could fully agree on what the finished picture looked like. Then, years later, a private letter written by Bartlett himself surfaced, and hidden inside that letter was the statement that finally explained why he had remained silent for so long. A statement that would force historians to rethink the entire mystery from the beginning years after Bartlett's death. One of his private letters surfaced in a collection of family papers. At first, nobody thought much of it. The letter wasn't addressed to a government official. It wasn't marked confidential. It wasn't even discussing the Arctic directly. It was written to an old friend who had spent years exploring remote parts of the world. Most of the letter dealt with ordinary subjects: health, travel, the changing nature of exploration. Then, near the end, Bartlett wrote a sentence that immediately caught historians' attention. The greatest danger in exploration is not what a man discovers. It is what he convinces himself he has discovered. That line changed everything, because suddenly the mystery wasn't just about a strange Arctic location. It was about what happened after people encountered it. For decades, researchers had been trying to determine what Bartlett found. Now a different question emerged. What made him so reluctant to talk about it? The answer appeared hidden inside the events that followed the expedition. Think about what happened. A survey team visits the site. An object is brought back to the ship. Arguments erupt almost immediately. Scientists later disagree about the samples. Surveyors disagree about the formation. Government officials arrive and restrict access. Everyone seems to be looking at the same evidence, yet nobody reaches the same conclusion. That wasn't normal, and Bartlett knew it. The more investigators examined the surviving records, the more they realized something important. Bartlett wasn't trying to hide a discovery. He was trying to prevent a conclusion. There's a difference. One suggests secrecy. The other suggests caution. And that distinction may explain why he ordered the crew to remain silent, not because he knew exactly what they had found, because he didn't. The strongest evidence for that idea came from a forgotten interview recorded late in the life of one crew member. The sailor was asked directly whether Bartlett ever explained what happened at the site. His answer surprised everyone. He said no. According to the sailor, Bartlett repeatedly told the crew the same thing. "We know what we saw, we do not yet know what it means." That statement spread through the expedition. Some men accepted it, others didn't. One surveyor reportedly spent years trying to prove his interpretation was correct. Another abandoned the subject completely. The disagreement never truly ended. And then investigators uncovered one final piece of evidence: a laboratory memorandum connected to the canvas-wrapped object. Unlike earlier documents, this one wasn't discussing theories. It was discussing results. The object had been examined repeatedly, tested, measured, compared against known formations. And after months of study, the final conclusion was surprisingly simple. The object itself wasn't extraordinary, at least not in the way many people imagined. It was most likely a naturally occurring formation altered by unusual geothermal conditions. In other words, the object wasn't the mystery. The environment that created it was. That revelation solved one of the oldest questions in the story. What was inside the canvas? A recovered sample. The very first sample brought back from the site. The object that started the argument. The object Bartlett ordered removed from public view. The object that eventually reached government laboratories. For the first time since the opening minutes of our story, the mystery had come full circle. The canvas-wrapped object was no longer a missing piece. It had become the key that connected everything. But one question still remained. If the object had a natural explanation, why did this story survive for nearly a century? Why did people keep returning to it generation after generation? The answer has less to do with geology than with human nature. And it would become the final lesson Bartlett left behind. If this story were only about a strange rock, nobody would remember it. The reason we're still talking about it nearly a century later has nothing to do with geology. It has everything to do with people. Because once the canvas-wrapped object was identified, researchers expected the mystery to disappear. Instead, something surprising happened. The facts became clearer, but the story became bigger. The object appears to have been a naturally formed sample created under unusual geothermal conditions. The strange temperatures reported by Lund suddenly made sense. The exposed ground made sense. The wildlife observations made sense. Even many of the scientific disagreements began to make sense. For the first time, most of the puzzle pieces fit together. Yet one thing still stood out: the reactions, the arguments, the silence, the obsession. Why did so many intelligent people become consumed by this discovery? The answer may be the most human part of the entire story. When explorers enter the unknown, they don't just bring equipment. They bring expectations. Every person who reached that Arctic site saw the same landscape, but they didn't see the same story. One man saw an unusual geological formation. Another saw evidence that existing maps were wrong. Another saw proof that science had overlooked something important. And some saw possibilities that went far beyond the evidence itself. The site became a mirror. People looked at it and saw what they believed. Bartlett understood that danger better than anyone. That's why the crew argument mattered. That's why the private meeting mattered. That's why the order to remain silent mattered. Not because he had solved the mystery, because he knew nobody had. And in a strange way, history proved him right. Over the decades, theories came and went. Some claimed hidden structures, others proposed lost civilizations. Some insisted governments were covering up extraordinary discoveries. Yet every time new evidence appeared, the story moved closer to something far more believable. Not a secret, an explanation. Not certainty, understanding. And that brings us back to the locked box that arrived in Ottawa all those years later. For decades, people assumed the box contained a hidden truth, a confession, a revelation, something explosive. But the greatest surprise was that it contained something much more valuable, the evidence itself. The notes, the observations, the questions, the fragments. Whoever assembled the box wasn't trying to hide the story, they were trying to preserve it. Without those records, much of this mystery would have vanished forever. The argument aboard the ship would be forgotten. The survey team would be forgotten. Even the canvas-wrapped object might have disappeared from history entirely. Instead, enough survived for future generations to continue asking questions. And perhaps that's the real reason the story endures. Not because of what was discovered, but because of how people responded to it. Fear, curiosity, disagreement, wonder. Those reactions haven't changed much in 100 years. Before we finish, let me know in the comments. If you had been standing beside Bartlett that night, looking at the object wrapped in canvas, what do you think you would have believed? And if you've enjoyed this story, subscribe for more forgotten mysteries, hidden histories, and remarkable moments that shaped the world in ways most people never hear about. In the end, Bartlett may have left us with a lesson more valuable than any discovery. The unknown is powerful, not because it hides answers, because it reveals how we search for them. The Arctic kept most of its secrets. The ice erased many of the details, but one thing survived: a trail of evidence, a trail of questions, and the story of a captain who understood that finding something unusual is easy. Understanding it is the hard part, and sometimes that journey is the real discovery.